Now we'll move on to session 2, which is focused on technology and adaptation amid population aging. And we have 2 speakers, Albert Park from the Asian Development Bank and Linda Grattan from the London Business School. I think we have a recording of her because she had a schedule conflict. And our discussant is Chris Pissaridis from the London School of Economics. So Albert, would you like to take us away? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So this is the question that was posed to me, and I'm going to focus a little bit by focusing on how technology can affect extending working life, which is an issue which has been emphasized by the earlier discussants. And I want to present some stylized facts about aging in Asia, then talk a little bit about the theory of technology and labor supply, as well as labor demand, and then present some of the most recent evidence on impacts of technology on older workers, then conclude with some policy recommendations. So this is another figure of the trend of rapid population aging. This is particular to Asia, and the only thing why I want to emphasize here is that we're really at a point where the number of people over age 65 is really going to explode, and it's going to reach over 800 million people in Asia over 65 by the year 2050. If we look at the characteristics of older people in terms of both age and cohort differences, what's notable is that the schooling differences or educational attainment differences are much greater for younger people and people born in more recent cohorts, so that certainly we will see the metabolism of demography creating much healthier older people as we go. And similarly for health, the healthy lifespan of Asians has increased by 6.6 years from 1990 to 2017. But of course, during this period, retirement ages have not increased accordingly. So that's kind of the rub that many people have pointed to. If you look at the changes in labor force participation of older workers in some of the Asian economies described here, you can see as expected with greater health and education, there's more labor force participation of older people in the more developed economies like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and even Korea. But for the poorer or more developing countries, India and Indonesia, you see actually there's a slight decline in labor force participation. And this really is the story of rural people who, work till they drop, shifting to the urban sector where there's retirement programs, so they actually retire earlier. And that kind of outweighing this dynamic of healthier and more educated people retiring later. And here's a figure that shows the concentration of older workers in agriculture in a lot of the Asian economies, and even the more developed ones. In Japan and Korea, it's really old people who are dominating the agricultural sector. But in the other countries too, you see higher percentages of older people in agriculture. And that's really important in thinking about policy towards aging people in emerging Asia, because the older people are just so different than the younger people. So if we think about theory just for a moment, if you just write a simple model of utility maximization, labor supply is going to become a function of preferences people have about working or leisure. It's going to be a reflection of human capital. Cognition, of course, is really important for older people, physical health, mental health, and then technology's impact on labor productivity. And of course, technology can also affect all of these elements of that affect labor supply. It can influence preferences, especially the fact that older workers may prefer flexible work from home, which technology facilitates. Certainly skills in terms of health effects and being more connected to families, so having better mental health. And of course, through capital and embodied technology, it has a major influence on labor productivity. Other things just to keep in mind in thinking about how technology affects labor is, of course, there's a big issue about whether the technology is a substitute or a complement to labor. If it's in very labor scarce societies, I think it being a substitute is actually not a bad thing, because usually it just improves productivity in the economy, and the workers can focus on the activities that are not being replaced by technology. But when it's a labor surplus area, there's more of a rub in terms of labor demand and employment generation. It's also important to realize that different technologies are different in how they may affect workers with different skills, and that any given technology will affect people with different skills differently. So an age you can think of as a dimension of skill, in that older workers have certain comparative advantage compared to younger workers. And so a lot of the technologies that have been discussed by researchers, there's been quite a lot of work now on computers and more recently on automation or robots. And I think in the future, we're going to see much more work on digitalization and AI, which there's really still relatively little research understanding of. So in a report that ADB produced a couple of years ago on demographic change, productivity, and the role of technology, we identified, this is actually before I went to ADB, coincidentally, but we identified these different ways in which technology can affect productivity. One is, the first two again are either being a substitute or a complement to labor and skills. Third is that technology can aid in education and skills development. Fourth is it can improve the matching of workers to job tasks. And finally, it can extend life and healthy life expectancy through, telemedicine, much more sophisticated real-time monitoring of elderly health conditions, et cetera. And just to give you a couple of examples of complementary technology and things that really help the elderly, this is a picture of exoskeletons in a Hyundai factory. So the technology creates kind of half man, half machines who can really handle much more manual labor, even at older ages. And another interesting app that was developed and was reported in this ADB report is an app that matches older workers who are active, older people really who are active, to jobs and tasks in the local communities. And obviously, this is a really effective way to use labor capacity in a way that is flexible, and the work is nearby. And so there's quite a lot of engagement. And so this is an example of kind of the matching potential for technology. And then coming back to the last part of theory I want to emphasize, and it's about some of the dynamics. So a lot of the literature which has argued that technology is harmful to the elderly has focused on obsolescence of skills of older people, that they just can't adapt to the new technology, or to use the new technology, they need to make new investments. And if they're close to the end of their working life, they really don't feel it's worth making those investments and they'd rather retire. And so that points to, if we think about that investment choice, it's going to be heavily influenced by expected years left of work. And so it, again, is going to hinge on the design of pension programs, which will have a huge effect on this incentive to invest. And the last thing I wanted to mention is the phenomenon of use it or lose it, which is particularly true for cognition. And so there's an interesting paper by my former colleague, Bob Willis, and Susan Rottweiler, I'm not sure I'm getting that name right, where they show that the countries that have a greater pension incentive to retire, you do see, as Axel demonstrated, a much bigger difference in the labor force participation of older workers compared to younger workers. And that translates directly, in an IV estimation model to faster declines in cognition in those countries as people age. And so that's like a vicious downward cycle, right? That that once you stop working, your cognition just goes down faster, which would make it even harder to ever think about coming back into the labor force. Okay, so what about the evidence on technology and its impact on older workers? A number of recent studies, I think, provide some reason for optimism. This paper that was published in, I think, R.E. Stud by Acemoglu and Restrepo finds that robots reduce employment less for older workers and increase wages both absolutely and relatively in the US. There's some other work by colleagues of mine at the ADB, and this park is not Albert Park, it's Tom Park, a researcher at the ADB. But they found that robots reduce the negative impact of aging on sectoral productivity growth in Korea, that having more older workers is more positively associated with growth in high productivity countries, which you can kind of read as high technology countries. And a more recent paper looks at how growth in robots and software growth in different types of technology affects the wages of older workers. And they find that it depends on the type of technology. Robots and software tend to increase the relative wage of older workers. The growth in ICT capital is neutral, and growth in non-ICT capital decreases the relative wage of older workers. And just to show you some more detail here, one thing that was interesting in the Acemoglu and Restrepo paper was that they show that in the US, the older workers are actually less likely to be blue-collar workers. That's the left-hand figure. And also, they're less likely to work in sectors that are vulnerable to automation. And that kind of explains the result, which is, which is here, where they show that on the top figure is the employment effects. And you can see that most of the employment effects are concentrated in the middle-aged workers and almost no effect on the oldest group. Whereas for wages, it's only the older group that actually seems to benefit in a relative sense. This is an important issue in Asia because Asia is where almost all of the robotization is occurring. This is just data from the International Federation of Robots. And you can see the huge increases in Asia. And I've been doing some work on robot-related firms in China, and there's been an explosion of firms that list something related to robots in their business line descriptions in the last couple of years. And the last thing I want to show is some work by Bob Willis and another co-author, Hu Domiet, in an article published in 2021 on obsolescence. And they're looking at computer use. And these figures show the percentage of people who are using computers at work for different ages, as reflected in labor market experience, and for different birth cohorts. And the interesting pattern here is that there's kind of a convergence to a relatively high level of computer use, regardless of what cohort you were born in, except for the oldest cohorts, because those are the ones that, computers showed up when they were 50s or 60s, close to retirement, and they just never got up to really learning how to use computers in their work. And so it's that older group, when a new technology comes in, that is most vulnerable to obsolescence, right? So one thing they do from this data is that they calculate what's called a knowledge gap, which is basically a difference in computer use for the older group compared to the younger workers in a given point in time. And you can see in the bottom right, these gaps are biggest for the older workers who were born much earlier. And you can see that for those individuals, the gap is largest for college workers. So in other words, the older college educated workers, when computers just came out, you just see them, the gap between their computers use being much bigger than, much lower than the young college graduates at the same time, because those young college graduates are just seizing on the technology. So you get this biggest gap, and those are the most likely people to become obsolete. And so what they find is that older workers with a higher gap in computer use compared to younger workers had lower wages and were more likely to retire. And they also found that this negative impact of computer use gaps on working was greater for women, middle skilled workers, and office workers.
1 minute.
Okay, great. So what about digitalization? Of course, this is a transformative kind of technological change in a kind of a very partial equilibrium way, thinking about the direct effects on older workers. I think one should be optimistic because it supports better cognition and physical and mental health through some of the examples I gave earlier. It really enables flexible work and the creation more of a gig economy for older workers, which should be a model that they would prefer. But of course, it requires access and to digital technologies and literacy. And so that could be limiting, especially in the countries where today's elderly are very poorly educated. And then, of course, a lot of questions about AI. I wanted to come back to this idea that, the current elderly, we have a lot of uneducated people. And so the results on robotization may be different because those regressions by Acemoglu and Restrepo controlled for education. But if older workers are less educated, they could be doing much more routine work and could be more easily replaced. And so that the generalizations may not hold for the emerging economies in Asia. Okay, so last is the policy kind of discussion. And the first, of course, is governments could try to influence the types of technologies that are developed through subsidies and tax incentives. And there's a pretty interesting discussion that I had in a panel discussion with Danny Roderick and Darren Acemoglu about, is it time to rethink, directed technological change where we really think about incentivizing the type of technologies. There's probably some scope to that. And then finally, the other ones are about pension system design, which have already been made, that this is a real inhibitor to older people investing in the skills to use new technologies if there's a very strong incentive to retire, or if the labor regulations preclude really flexible forms of work. And one form of flexibility that hasn't been mentioned is flexibility in wages at older ages. In Japan, when you retire, when you hit retirement age, you're like retired that day, but the firm may hire you back the next day, but at a much lower wage, because they realize if the wages don't become more flexible, a lot of firms are going to want their older workers to retire because they've lost productivity. Let me stop there. Thanks.